Welcome to Stress-Free IEP. You do not need to do it all alone. With your host, Francis Shefter, Principal of Shefter Law. You can get more details and catch prior episodes at www.shefterlaw.com. The Stress-Free IEP video podcast is also posted on YouTube and LinkedIn, and you can listen to episodes through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more. Now, here's the host of Stress-Free IEP, Francis Shefter.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. Today's guest is April Rehrig, and she is out in California. And April is a special education advocate, a school psychologist, and the founder of Rise Educational Advocacy. April, say hello and tell us why you started Rise Educational Advocacy.
Hi, Francis. Thanks so much for having me. That's a great question to ask. Why I started Rise. I guess the answer would be I started Rise because after being a school psych for 20 years and being a mom of 3 kids and being a teacher, I wanted to make advocacy affordable and accessible. And so I crafted my business to do online support and really make things easier for teachers and parents and everyone at the table. And so that's why I started Rise, to kind of connect families with schools and really reform how we meet and how we talk about strength-based IEPs.
That is awesome. Similar to me, like started off in the school and said, we need to do something different, right?
Exactly.
So you're just doing the advocacy now, right? You're not doing any of the school psychology anymore?
No, I left. I left before the pandemic. I guess I got lucky with the silver lining, but I left. I retired and I formulated my business. And then because of the pandemic, I was like, wow, okay, I can do things online. So it's sort of all worked out, I guess you could say.
Got it. That makes sense. Yeah. I love that you've retired. And I used to say all the time, my father worked more after he retired, because he could then do what he wanted to do, so I know like you do a lot of, a big thing we have is requesting assessments. And I know from my point of view, like what I do as an education attorney and advocate, and also a former special ed teacher, but I'm sure from a psychologist view, like what is it you think like is really important to make sure the psychologist really knows what the parent is asking for?
That's a great question, Francis. And that's one of actually the biggest things that I help families do is when I first became an advocate, I knew that families were like, I need testing. But because I was a school psychologist, I thought, okay, I know what they need to ask for because as a psych, I know what I wanted to hear. And that's one of the biggest barriers is that families are told, well, just ask for testing. But it's not just in your ask, but it's how you ask, when you ask, and what you ask for, because you have to tell the school what you're suspecting and what you're looking for. So when I became an advocate and then I formed Rise, I decided to sell very low-cost templates because there's not a lot out there in terms of saying, well, what do you say in the letter? And then families get really confused because the school honestly doesn't really tell you, okay, here's what you need to say in the letter. They'll say, just write it down. But we all know that how we write it and how we ask is not only going to fast track testing, get the assessment approved, but really get an assessment that's individualized and catered. So if you don't know that, and nobody is going to know that, then why not figure out a better way to inform families? And so that's why I created the templates, because I wanted to make it really easy and not, hours and hours of trying to write a dang letter.
Right. No, that's awesome. I love that you have templates because I know like around here a lot, I get a lot of clients of like, well, I've been asking for templates for over a year, not templates. I've asking for testing for over a year and they just keep saying, no, we don't see special ed. And it's so frustrating. But then usually, if the clients don't engage with me, I'll just tell them like, look, hey, you need to write an email to the principal and the special ed coordinator and specifically say, this is what I suspect. I want testing. We need to have a meeting within 30 days. So like have the language there, because if not, they just ignore it. But once you use the language of know what you're asking for and know the deadlines, amazing how schools respond, right?
Yes, I worked with a family a month ago, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners will resonate with this story. She moved to a new school. She sat down with the counselor and said, I'm really, I want my child tested. I'm suspecting dyslexia. And she wasn't really informed. Well, you have to write it down. Well, you need to ask for IEP testing. And so the counselor said, oh, thank you so much for letting me know. He's in the RTI program. That's so great. And nothing happened for months and months and months.
Yeah.
And then once she started working with me and we wrote down a letter, she was like, oh my gosh, if I would have known to say I want IEP testing, if I would have known my rights, it would have saved a half a year.
Right. And that's why I do this show. And I also have my YouTube channel with over 100 videos, because it frustrates me so much. And I don't blame the schools. I know, we've worked for the school systems. I don't blame them. They do what they can with what they have. They do the best they can. But it's just frustrating because it's, the parents don't know and they don't know what to ask, and the school's not always offering, or sometimes the school doesn't necessarily know. The counselor might not know that it needs to be this way or how it needs to be done. And I find that and it's just a lot. And it's just so frustrating for me that I guess, like, I'm just thinking, like, the parents don't know, but how would they know? You know what I mean? Like, as parents, we have our kids, and great, they don't come with the handbook. And as soon as you think you figure it out, they switch the game up. And the second one comes, and it's completely different. And then you add neurodiversity to it, and it's just a whole nother ball game. And to know in the special ed process, I've been in this industry way more years than I want to want to share, but like, even with me, things change all the time, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly, you brought up a really good point, Frances, about education and training. And when I was a teacher in a school psych, we wanted IEP training. We wanted to know how to write IEPs. And honestly, we were not given training. We were told, okay, this is a compliant IEP. I was never trained as a school psych how to connect my assessments with the reports. I was never trained on strength-based IEPs. And any training we got was given by someone who was not a teacher and not someone who worked in the classroom. And so the whole time I'm like, well, if they want us to do better, why don't they give us the training?
Right.
And so you bring up such a good point.
Yeah, no. And I remember back as teachers, like I remember learning, God, I'm trying to remember, it was like when I was a special ed teacher, I remember learning IEPs, and in one training, they're like, oh, the way it should be is that, a goal should be, if you're saying 75%, then objective 1 is to reach it at 25%, and objective 2 is to reach it at 50%, and objective 3, and that way. And so all of my IEPs were just like that, which is not necessarily individualized and not necessarily the way it should be written, but that was a little bit of training I got. And it's like, oh, this is what they should look like. Oh, okay, let's make it look like that. Which, as we know, is not individualized.
Right. And then if you're not given the right information, you just pass it on. And so you're exactly right with the counselor in mind that happened to my client. The counselor hadn't been trained, so it wasn't her fault. And a lot of the mistakes that happen in special education are because someone told someone else, okay, this is what FAPE means, or this is LRE, and there isn't really a training. And so just like the game of telephone, the information gets misinterpreted, and it's just, all of this can be reformed, but we have to revise how and when we communicate at the table to get better IEPs.
Right. Yeah, no. And I look back of when I was a teacher and when I was a special ed coordinator, and I look back at the things and what I did. And honestly, I look back and I'm like, yeah, that probably wasn't legal, but that's what my bosses told me. That's what central office told me. That's what the principal told me. So that's what I knew to do. And I didn't know any better. And so, and that's a thing. And that's why, like, I never put it on the teachers or the school staff. It's a systemic issue all over the place of just the training. And it's, what? There's so much training to be done for teachers. It's really a challenge. Whereas like if they had like one special ed person that it's like just known, if anybody asks any special ed questions, send them to this one person, that like centralize it all. So everybody doesn't know have to know everything. They just have to know if they hear the words testing, evaluation, special education, call this person. And then it just makes it more streamlined and easier for everyone.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if we think about, for those of your teacher listeners out there, you'll resonate with this, but like every week we always had in-services, and all of us in the special ed department, I would be like, gosh, well, can't we meet? No. You need to go to the ELA. You need to go to that. I'm like, well, what about our team meetings? And I found, like, honestly, when we met as a team, when, for example, some of the schools I was at, we were able to map out all of the year in advance of all of our meetings, or we would sit there and not pre-meet about an IEP, but talk about, okay, like, what's the plan? How are we doing that? And if we had time to collab and we just incorporated that in our normal prep time, that was the best way to do it. Or if we psychs, we had like a monthly meeting and we could just collab together and trade info on cases. That's it. So the availability is there. It's just getting that kind of aha, I can do this with my team better and I can plan better is so much easier than going to those dang, monthly meetings. And you're like, I spent 3 hours here in PD and I didn't learn anything at all.
I remember those days. Yeah. And I mean, I get it because the principals probably, whatever, like this is what the in-service has to look like. And it's, they kind of stock our training as teachers and psychologists rather than individualize it to what our needs are and what the kids' needs are. It just gets so frustrating. Because I remember sitting in some of these in-services and I'm like, are you kidding me? Like I was teaching the very intellectually disabled. I mean, back then it was something totally different. That's not PC. I don't even know what they're calling now, but like my kids were the IQs under 40, the nonverbal and all that other stuff. So 95% of the in-services made no sense to me because it was completely I wasn't working on curriculum. My kids were all non-diploma bound. I was working on the function skills. And so like sitting there in this class to learn this stuff, and when I was doing it, it was way before internet. So it wasn't even like I could be on the computer to do, something like to work on my IEPs while I was sitting in this class.
Exactly. And the way that they do the in-services is a little bit like the boring lecture. They don't make it usable. So I felt like after I taught kindergarten, I'm like, all right, I'm going to teach everybody differently here because honestly, we learn so much better in short little increments and 20 minutes here and a video here, just like our kids. So when they do the PDs, they need to make them more interesting.
Right. Agreed. So for parents out there that are listening, because like this is, like, hey, parents, we know the schools are struggling too, right? What do you find is the best for parents to do, like going into an IEP meeting to make it more collaborative? Because there's just so many times, parents don't feel like they're part of the team. There was a meme out once with like 15 people on one side and 2 people on the other side. And over the 15 people is the school saying, we don't understand why it is you feel you need to bring an advocate with you. And it's like, well, let's look. So how do you think, like, what can parents do or say to help make it more collaborative?
That's a great question. So when you think about, collaboration and when you have a meeting coming up, for example, if you're a parent, you need to, first of all, tell the school what you're concerned about, and you need to formulate your information so you can attach it to their record. So I always tell my families, write a parent letter of attachment. And when you get the IEP invitation, or if you request an IEP invitation, you're going to attach it. And in your attachment, you're going to say, here is what my concerns are. Here are my child's strengths. Here is what I would like you to review and consider. So when the team finds out early, oh, okay, mom wants us to talk about A, B, and C. She put it in bullet points. She made it less than a page, so it's not overwhelming. And then you ask for drafts. And so with the drafts, for example, you can review the present levels of performance. You could submit as a parent what I call a parent report, which is where you put your information. Here's what I'm doing at home. Here's the outside evals. Here's what I want you to list on the present levels page. And then you're giving the team information. You're attaching it to your record. You're putting it on the IEP itself. And then when the team meets with you, they already know, oh, mom wants us to discuss this proposed goal, or mom is concerned about this, or here's an agenda that mom created and we're going to walk through the agenda. So then when you walk into the IEP, you have your child's record and you have like a whole little folder that you make, and it's got the prior IEPs in there, the progress reports, your parent letter of attachment, you bring copies. And then as the team's going through, they're like, what are your concerns? You're like, oh, I already submitted them. They should already be incorporated in the present level section in the parent input section. And then you pass out your agenda and the team's like, oh, now I know. You cut down the meeting time, you get your drafts, you can get to the offer of FAPE by cutting down the time because you're planning again. So it's sort of a proactive way of collaborating with your team instead of waiting for the IEP to fail, waiting for problems, looking for errors, and then be like, oh, this meeting was terrible. Now I'm going to say what I don't like.
Right. No, and I love that because doing the in writing before the meeting is then like one of the issues I have often is that PWNs, the prior written notice that comes after meeting, are just junk. And 95% of the time, they don't include everything they're supposed to include. And if the parents, I actually didn't quite know this, but if the parents write like, hey, here are the errors in the PWN, the school's supposed to edit the PWN. And they never do.
They have to respond. You're exactly right. They have to respond.
Yep. And so, that was a violation on a state complaint that I did. But so then you can say, on this date, I sent you this letter asking for all of these things. So now all of this, if it didn't get discussed, needs to be on the PWN of why it didn't get discussed. Because school, you had that responsibility. This is what I wanted as a team member. And it kind of puts that accountability back on them. And I know for me, I found is that once the family starts using the language and starts, quoting the laws and just saying the rules and stuff, and even sometimes saying, well, I was talking to an attorney and she said that the schools start changing a little bit on their attitude and the things they do.
Yeah, that's actually true. It's kind of sad that it requires someone else to come in, but you're absolutely right. 100% of the time when I was a school psych and we had an advocate come in, everyone would dot their I's, cross their T's. They would just sit up more. They'd be more willing to do stuff. And it shouldn't be like that.
Yeah.
But the reality is it's true. Just like if you go anywhere else and someone hears like even a whiff of like an attorney involved, people are like, ooh, you need to be careful.
Right. It's funny that you say that because like people always ask like the difference between an advocate and an attorney, and I full 100% support advocates. I think they're great. There's a place. The difference, at least around here, is when you bring an attorney to a meeting, their attorney comes and central office comes.
Yeah.
And central office is the decision makers, and so it's a very different meeting when you have the higher ups looking at you.
Yeah, that's true. And you bring up a really good point is that sometimes I'll have families and they'll say, man, I do not get along with this teacher, or this principal's always, da 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 da. And I'll say, well, you can ask someone from the district to come to the meeting. You can ask for a facilitated IEP. You can ask for another representative to come to the meeting because there's a conflict of interest with so-and-so. And so parents can ask for people from the district to come to the meeting. But again, they have to tell them in advance. They have to cite the reasons why, and they have to let the team know what's going on. If they don't say anything to the IEP, it's not useful.
Right. No, that's so true. And that's the thing. It's a lot of, you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what to ask for. And that's, again, the reason for my show is to put it out there like, hey, do this or ask that and stuff like that. So I know a big thing that I get a lot is clients, families don't understand like accommodations and modifications and like, what's the difference? Because we also call them supplementary aids and services, and like, wait, what's what and why and where and how does that all work? So what's the difference?
That's a great question. I did a blog on this and I did several reels, and honestly, it was one of the highest rated items that I did because there's such misinformation out there. So if you think about accommodations versus modifications, accommodations are going to adjust how. How is the instruction delivered? How is the information given? And accommodations are kind of broken into 4 different subtypes. So when you look at an accommodation, it could be instructional, it could be time, it could be how you're delivering the information, how you're receiving it. There's 4 kind of different subtypes of an accommodation. Now, a modification is going to be adjusting the what. what is the curriculum, what are we doing, and what adjustments are being made. So an accommodation is going to be working on access to the curriculum and is not going to be altering the curriculum itself, versus a modification is. An accommodation really has to do with the delivery of the information, versus a modification is more of the actual output of the information itself. So there's kind of two different camps. And if you think about an accommodation, that also has to do with prompting and cueing, which is pretty much given before and after. So like a prompt hierarchy, all of those things, that's an accommodation, versus a modification is the actual output of the information. Now, there gets to be some kind of gray matter when people will say, well, I want less homework assignments, right? I want to do 5 instead of 10. And the team will be like, oh my gosh, that's a modification. And the answer is it can be one or the other. It really depends on how you word it. So if you're doing less assignments, but you're still expected to be using the grade level curriculum, that's actually a non-accommodation. Versus a modification is you're doing 5 out of 10 assignments and maybe you're using a second grade curriculum instead of a third grade. So it's really depending on how you word it. And that's honestly, when it comes to accommodations and modifications, these need to be embedded in the present levels page, and they need to be embedded into the goals, because the accommodations and modifications are actually the setup to achieve the goals. And these come from the present levels that start from the assessment.
Right. Yes, because it's all supposed to be connected.
Exactly.
And they're so not. Some IEPs, like I know DC's IEPs actually has, you do present levels and then you do the goals. So instead of like all the present levels together and then all the goals together, which makes sense because your present levels is what sets the stage for what your goals should be. And, and
that's what I talk about. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, I want to touch on the modifications, because one thing that parents don't know that they have to be really careful with. I don't know how much you guys have the issues out there in California, but we have a lot with the alternative learning outcomes. At a very young age, schools trying to put the kids in the alternative learning outcomes, which, they say, oh, we're not determining if you're high school bound or not high school bound. We're just saying for now. But you start a kindergartner in alternative learning outcomes. And for those of you that don't know what those are, it means not curriculum, not grade level material. You're not working on Common Core curriculum. You're setting the kid up. You know what I mean? They're not, they're going to be 3 years on ALO and then automatically, oh, now they're on second grade level. Like it's not going to happen. So it's a big fight we have around here. And language that you have to watch for that they put on the IEPs is the modifications. Is like there's some modifications that are okay that are slight modifications, like one we do is alternative output. So like the child might not have to write a essay, they might be able to verbally say their essay or things like that, which is technically a modification, but it's not modifying the curriculum. And that's the careful you need to do, because once you get into modifying the curriculum, that's when you start having issues with, well, is this a diploma-bound child or not diploma-bound child?
Yeah, that's exactly true. And one of the things that I found that's most frustrating for families, and this happened to me as a parent several times, is that your child starts to struggle and the team meets and the IEP team is like, okay, they are failing pre-algebra. So we're going to put them in what's called a non-A through G in California, the non-A through G class. So that still gets a diploma, but it means it's not college prep. And they were trying to place my kids in the class. And this happens to so many families. We're failing, so we're going to put you in a lower class instead of what you're supposed to be doing for LRE, which is you meet as a team and you're like, oh, let's make some adjustments. Let's add some accommodations. Let's change some goals before we change to a more restrictive environment. And instead of expecting less for our kids, we can maintain those high expectations by working with their strengths. And strengths are derived from accommodations and modifications. Those need to be based on strengths, not based on weakness. So you would never do a setup for like an Amazon package and say, well, I'm going to tell Amazon to deliver it by train because that's a weakness, right? Amazon delivers on a truck. That's their strength. They're on time. Right. So you work with the strengths and the accommodations and modifications to help them achieve the goals. And again, this is the whole reason why you're exactly right. We need to work on the setups. And when we work on the setups, we can actually increase inclusionary practices without having to put kids in lower classes and basically expect less.
Yeah. And that's a big challenge. That is the biggest challenge because, well, they're not being successful. Well, why aren't they being successful? Are they not being successful because the pace is too fast? Is it not being successful because they need to repeat it a little bit more? Is it not, like looking at why the child is not being successful to determine what needs to be done? Because I've seen that way too many times is that, schools are like, well, they're not being successful, so let's make the goals easier. Well, they're not being successful, so let's make the goals easier. And, like that they're pushing for, like the school thinks, oh, this child should be life skills, alternative learning outcome. But if the parents don't agree, they cannot use alternative learning outcomes in Maryland, at least. So, but the school keeps trying to push for that. So they keep trying to lower the goals, and parents not knowing what's happening, they're kind of keyholing their kid. The school's kind of doing it in the background. And then the parents are getting themselves locked into this position that is really hard to get back out of.
Exactly. And that goes back to the setup. So if a child is not achieving the goals, one of the things the teams can do is look at the accommodations. So when you have a progress report, for example, and they're looking at the goals, you also need to look at the accommodations. Are these working? Are these not working? What do we need to adjust? And you do not get accommodations from a drop-down menu. I know they're on the IEP, but accommodations really come from the assessment. And honestly, when the child comes to the IEP, and they should be coming, I always work with my kids, having them come in elementary school. And it's like, what works for you? What do you like? Oh, I really like video games. Awesome. We're going to use this visual, because you are really receptive to visual and like saturation. I'm not going to have you do extended time if time is a struggle for you, because why should I give you more of what you struggle with?
Right, exactly. And it's always the stock, but I love that. Yeah, I didn't even think about bringing them when they were younger, but definitely in middle school, high school, like when you're supposed to start inviting them. I like to have the kids come to do that, the accommodations, and I do not want them sitting through the whole IEP meeting most of the time because they're boring for us as adults. You can imagine the kids going through it. And it's hard to listen to some of that, but definitely for the accommodations and supplementary aids, because, hey, the kids know what's working.
Right. And then if they take their IEP to college, and many of them do, it's like if they've been part of the meeting and they're in it, it makes a whole difference. So they understand what's effective, and then they can sit there. And then as the parent, you're pulling back because you have to pull back on stuff, on the accommodations and the services, because if you heavy duty it up till senior year, and then you're like, we're getting into UCLA, but the child isn't been used to moving into that kind of self-advocacy and self-determination phase, then it's not helping. So you should be pulling back junior and senior year and just kind of hanging out. And then your child is running the meeting because they're like, I know what I need. I know how to access disability supports in college. And I understand that this is what I need. And once I get into college, I can access these services myself because I've been advocating already at the table.
Right. And so there's two things on that I want to touch on. First, IEPs don't go to college at all because they're not. IEPs die when you graduate high school, but you can get accommodations under the American Disabilities Act. The eligibility is different and what's allowed is different. And the other reason parents need to pull out, which parents get frustrated, is it doesn't matter that you're paying the bill, mom and dad. Your child is 18 years old. And in the eyes of the law,
I talk about the FERPA waiver. Right? Yeah, I was talking about that over the weekend with at a conference with other parents. But yeah, the FERPA waiver, signing the FERPA waiver, and even if your child doesn't have an IEP or a 504, and you have a typical, what we call a typical child, which is not typical, you need to know about the FERPA, because if you don't sign the waiver, you're not going to get any of the tuition statements, so you're not going to know anything.
Right, exactly. And that's the thing. Like I did a presentation for Florida Ahead and on that, and like they're just the disability offices are saying, yeah, parents walk in and be like, here's my child's IEP, you need to implement it. It's like, well, no, one, no, we don't. Two, we're not talking to you because we can't, and parents are like, what do you mean? And it's a hard pill, but I love that you say that, is that the parents should pull back and let the kids step up to the plate more in junior and high school, because they're the ones that are going to have to do it. They're going to have to go to the disabilities office and ask for it. And if they can articulate it better, there's more of a chance of them being able to get the accommodations that they need.
And when they sit in the meeting, I mean, a lot of parents are like, oh, I don't want my kid to hear this. And I'm like, why? I'm like, why is it doesn't have to be like that. When my kids come to their IEP, things change. Parents, teachers speak to them differently. They don't talk about, they talk to. And some parents will be like, well, my child has intellectual disability. I'm like, but they can express themselves. They can, even if they're not verbal, they can say what they like, what they don't like. Imagine your child coming into a meeting and talking about they want to do things themselves. Oh my gosh, like that is crazy empowering to be able to sit at the table and tell someone what you like and what you don't like. I mean, that's the whole goal, right? Is we want to help our kids to be more successful. So I argue that there's nothing to lose and everything to gain by having your child at the meeting. And people behave differently when they have to talk to the student at the meeting. It's a very, very different process.
So we were talking about college kids going and about when they're in 11th and 12th grade, the parents stepping back and letting the kids take over and argue it more, taking that responsibility on. Yeah, which is so important because, but like thinking about it now, and I'm like, yeah, my elementary school kids, they can come in and say what they need and what's working.
Absolutely. And what do you want to say to your teacher, and what helps you, and what's hard for you, and what do you want to work on? Right? Working, like when I would work with students when I did the school-based counseling, I would show them a copy of their IEP and they're like, I've never seen this before. I'm like, well, what are you working on? I don't know. So I'm like, let's sit down, let's look at the goal. Like, here's what you're working on. Oh, do you feel like, this is helpful for you? Well, kind of. It's like they need to know what they're working on. So I feel like it should be the complete opposite. When you're having a teacher conference for your child needs to be in the conference. Even if they're in elementary school, we're talking about them, they need to be at the meeting. So I feel like it really changes the game plan. And honestly, teachers speak differently when their student is there. They speak really differently. And it's not a bad thing. It's just, again, it's like, what's the goal here,
Right. No, it's so true. And I'm just thinking about it like my fourth grader shares things like, well, it's so frustrating because the teacher doesn't do this or doesn't do that. And I'm like, and I can relay that to her teacher. And my daughter's school is phenomenal and they're very receptive to, they're phenomenal in a way. I would say also what I do for a living, they kind of know. So, but they're phenomenal anyway. But thinking about it of like the teacher hearing it from her.
Oh my gosh.
Is
how different would that be, Frances? And then she's speaking to her, and then how great would that make your daughter feel? It's like, I said these things to you, Mom, but now I can tell someone. It's like, it's very empowering, and it makes the teacher speak differently because they're speaking to instead of at.
Right. No, that makes so much sense. And instead of all of us talking about her and what we think she needs, she's my 10-year-old is a little, she knows what she wants. She knows how to say it. I'm just thinking about it. I'm like, yeah, I think she's coming to the next IEP meeting.
She's going to put on her little hat and like sit next to you.
Oh, she will. She will love it because she's like, wait, I get to tell everybody. She's a firecracker. My younger one, she would probably, but she's a little more chill. But yeah, no, that's so cool. So I know, we were talking about testing in the beginning. And so I know you were saying you have templates, but is there like a top 10 tips you could give parents, like when asking for IEP testing? Like what are some reasons they should be thinking about putting in their letters?
Yes. So when it comes to a special education assessment, let's say you're requesting for an initial or what's called a reevaluation or an early try or supplemental. The first thing you want to ask for is the scope of the assessment. So in regular terms, that has to do with what kind of testing do you want? So you need to tell them, I would like a full psychoeducational assessment. I would like a supplemental academic. I would like a speech and language assessment. So the scope, right? Who needs to be involved? And then the second thing you need to ask for is either what are the eligibility that you are suspecting, one or more, And then you need to look at your state website first to see what the rules are for eligibility and then cite it in there. And then also, what are the unique learning needs? So there's actually sort of 3 different areas. And the unique learning needs is going to tell the assessors what kind of tests you can give. You're not able to say, I want the WISC, I want this, but you can certainly say, I would like tests in executive functioning. I would like tests in this area. I would like this type of assessor with this expertise to work with my child. So when you're writing your letter, you're talking about eligibilities or related service areas you suspect. You're talking about unique learning needs, strengths, and the scope and sequence in terms of like what you expect the school to do about it.
No, that's perfect. And I want to touch on when you said the triennial review. So every 3 years, they have to relook at eligibility. And I've seen it and heard it so many times that it's like, oh, we don't suspect there's any other disability. We think that your kid is still, autistic, and autism is going to be the main label. So we don't need to do any other assessments. I'm like, we can do educational planning without it. And I'm always like flabbergasted that a school would say that, because at the very, very least, there needs to be academic testing. Because if you don't have like that set of where your child is academically, like, yes, it's a standardized test. I hate standardized tests. Don't get me started on those because I'm not a good test taker. But but it's at least something that gives you a marking period, like a mark of where your child is. And then if your child's having behavior issues, you need to do behavior checklists. And you need to see what's going on. Like, I don't understand how schools have said, oh, we don't need any additional testing for educational planning. You haven't tested this child in 3 years. What are you going off of? And then for anybody listening, right?
That brings up a really good point, Frances. So when it comes time to the try assessment or the reevaluation, parents get, well, I call it assessment plan, but in other states it's referred to different things. But you get an assessment plan. But before you get the assessment plan, when you submit your parent letter of attachment, you can talk about the type of assessments that you want, because ideally the assessment plan is supposed to be jointly developed. You do not have to sign the assessment plan they give you. You can say, you know what, actually, I want testing in this. So with a triennial, for example, even if they're not going to give IQ testing, they still need to reestablish any changes. So a comprehensive assessment means they do testing in all the suspected areas and they review existing data. And part of reviewing existing data is, here was the initial IQ, here's the reeval, there's no suspected changes, and parent gave permission. So ideally, the school psychologist, when they give you the assessment plan for a try, they should be calling you before. I would call my families and be like, hey, I'm not going to be giving IQ testing. I just want to make sure that's okay. Or do you have any other suspicions you want me to look at? Oh, yes, I want this. Great, we're going to add that to the assessment plan. Or no, okay, it's okay, we don't do IQ testing. Great, we're going to put on their review of existing data, and I'm still writing about it in my report, but I'm not doing new testing. So that's where you can kind of get around that, is when you're looking at the assessment plan and you talk to the assessors early.
Yeah, so we don't do it the same out here in Maryland. We do, or supposed to do in Maryland and DC, a reevaluation planning meeting. So where the IEP team gets together and discusses what evaluations are needed. But I've seen it way more often than not that the school says, oh, we don't see any change in disability. They're still eligible. Let's move on. Usually it's because it is now December and they just realized that reevaluation eligibility was due in January. And so they don't have time to do the testing, And so, oops, let's do the eligibility. But for those listening, if you don't know, for parents listening, if your child has not been tested in the last 12 months, you can 100% ask for testing again. You do not have to wait for the triennial review. Do not let the school tell you, oh, no, the triennial review is in 2 years. I don't care. I want testing now. And go up. And I mean, especially like our kids that are having behavior issues and things are going on, you guys need the behavior checklists, period. Yeah, they're doing an FBA, but most people aren't trained how to do FBAs correctly, I've found, in school systems. And doing the checklists just makes it seem for me, because of the way the checklists are written, I feel it's more information and more like reliable information, because you're literally, the teachers and parents are just clicking through like, do they do this? Do they do that? You're not looking for antecedents or behaviors. It's just what you're seeing in the classroom. And if you do it, I also get frustrated when schools only do one teacher. I'm like, no, you need to do a core teacher and you need to do an elective teacher. And you need to do a subject the child likes and a subject the child doesn't like. Because those are all information of like, well, where are we seeing the behavior? So maybe it's something we need to tweak in that classroom, not necessarily a behavior that totally needs to be tweaked.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And when you think about an observations need to, I call it like the two-factor method. It's actually school psychologists, the gold standard is when school psychologists are doing an initial, a triennial, any type of assessment, they need to have two different assessments by two different assessors in two different environments. It's 2-2-2. So you should be, when I would observe as the school psych, I would go into the class they were awesome, and I would go into the class that they would struggle. And I would always do the observations through the riot method, which is you first review existing information, you do the interviews, you observe, you test last, because you need to test in terms of what you suspect. So you first have to have the reason for referral and then embed it out and then flesh it out last through the testing. If you're testing and you've never met the child, you never observed them, how do you know what to look for? So, it's just a different way of doing things, but honestly, it's a lot easier and faster to do it that way.
Right. You think, no, that makes sense. It makes sense, because I know like there's some people that are like, oh, I don't want to see the stuff beforehand because I want to form my own opinion and
Based
just
on
look at
what
the data.
though? Like, how do you know what to look
Right.
for? It's like you're like, okay, I'm going to pass the bar exam with no studying. Okay,
Yeah.
that's a great idea, but is that really going to help you?
No, and it's so frustrating because it's also like I've had psychologists do assessments, and it clearly said in our PWN, it clearly said that they were supposed to be doing behavior checklists, and the psychologist didn't do them. And when I asked at the IEP meeting, like, why? Well, I didn't see a need. But the IEP team just, that knows the child felt there was a need, and why can you unilaterally make that decision? It just like, review everything. And why is this child being referred and what's going on?
And that goes back to the reason for referral, which is what we were talking about earlier, Francis. And so if the parent in their parent letter of attachment is like, here is the reason for referral, right? So reason for referral is not eligibility. Reason for referral is not triennial. It's why is the child being referred? What are the suspected areas of need? What's a disability? And if it's embedded in the reason for referral and the language is there, it should be strong, then it should be pulled through the entire report. So when you're looking at the recommendations and the eligibility and the present levels, it's all pulled back. And that's why parents knowing what to write in their letter, oh my gosh, it's so powerful, instead of, well, I want my child tested because I'm suspecting a learning disability. And then you get the report and you're like, but they didn't test for auditory. And then the psych's like, but you never told me.
I didn't know, like, and that's
Yeah,
what goes back
exactly. And
to,
you don't know what you don't know, which goes back to, again, it's like, we can totally reform that if parents find out before, like, oh, wow, I can do this differently.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And I know I looked at your website. I don't usually do this, but I looked at your website real quick before we logged in, and you have so much in resources for parents there, which I love, because that's, my YouTube channel and everything, but it's so much. And I know you mentioned the blog about accommodations versus modifications, which I know we're going to have in the show notes below. We'll make sure there's a link to that. But if people want to get in touch with you, well, first of all, like, you're based in California. Do you only work in California, or what areas do you support families?
I support families nationwide. So I work in all different states. And so I do in-person work for local only, because that's obviously a lot easier.
Yes.
But I do virtual practice everywhere. And if people want to get in touch with me, they can go to my website, riseeducationaladvocacy.com. If they want to check out my Teachers Pay Teachers store, parents, teachers for fillable templates, do-it-yourself stuff, that's Teachers Pay Teachers / Rise Educational Advocacy, or they can follow me on Instagram at Rise Ed Advocacy.
That is so awesome. And all those links will be below. Thank you so much, April. I love, like, even though our jobs overflow a little bit, the word's escaping me, but like it's so different. Like, we all have different perspectives that we bring to the table, and I love it. So thank you so much for being in the show and sharing all of your information with our listeners.
You're so welcome, Frances.
You've been listening to Stress-Free IEP with your host, Frances Shefter. Remember, you do not need to do it all alone. You can reach Frances through shefterlaw.com, where prior episodes are also posted. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, and sharing the show with others through YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more.